Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Ryan O'Neill.
Always glad to have with us on a Tuesday, Dr. Gary Ostrower, longtime Alfred University history professor. Dr. Ostrower, how's the weather over in Allegheny County this morning?
Well, it's kind of between 70 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It's beach weather, really. It's just beautiful.
Same over here, Gary. Same over here. Meteorologist Rob Carolyn says we're going to get rain mixed in with that snow that fell, and it's going to get slushy out there. Well, there's a lot going on. The DOJ wrote a letter with a lot of signatures. We got the upcoming Nevada primary this Saturday. You've got the Democratic lineup in the Democrats' race for the White House November of this year. Dr. Ostrower, what do you want to start out with, the letter from the DOJ?
Well, I'd like to talk about the letter from the DOJ, but before I do, I would like to give something of a shout-out to a former colleague of mine who is fairly well known, certainly in the Allegheny County area. His name was Bill Dibrow, and Bill was a former fire chief in Alfred. He was an EMT in Alfred. He worked at Alfred University as a philosopher, a very, very good philosopher, for approximately 37 years. He was just one of these people who, if you needed something, you called on him. He was a very generous person. He was an extremely kind person, and he was utterly committed not only to university service but to public service generally. We need people like that. Ultimately, especially small communities like this work on the basis not so much of a paid crew, but rather of large number of volunteers. In the village of Alfred, probably 40% of all of the regular residents are involved in one kind of volunteer operation or another. And in Bill DeBrell's case, it was more than one activity. So he's going to be missed. He died last Thursday. There is going to be a memorial service this coming Saturday at 11 o'clock at Howell Hall in Alfred University. So if anyone out there remembers him and would want to go to the memorial service, that's 11 o'clock on Saturday in Howell Hall at Alfred University. On the DOJ letter. That letter originally had approximately 1,000 signatures, and within 3 days it had over 2,000 signatures, and apparently those signatures are still coming in. And the letter was a response to President Trump's intervention in the sentencing of Roger Stone. Roger Stone is a crony of the president. He is in many ways a rather disreputable individual. He was found guilty by a jury of, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, about 7 different counts of crimes that included jury tampering and things like that. He's a felon. And yet he was a good friend of the president, and the president intervened and did something that I can't remember any other president doing ever. And I say that again as a historian of American history. So he called, he denounced the sentence, and very, very soon after that, within 24 hours, the Attorney General, William Barr, intervened himself to demand a reduction of the sentence. And when Barr intervened on the basis of Trump's comments, 4 prosecutors on the case. These are career prosecutors. These are not people who are partisans in any sense. They resigned from the case. One of them resigned entirely from the Department of Justice. These are people who acted on conscience. These are people who obviously have a good deal of courage, and it led to something of a firestorm. The DOJ employees, the Department of Justice employees, those 2,000 who have written this letter or have signed the letter, and I say DOJ employees, these are really former employees, what they said is the following. Such behavior, and by that they mean the intervention of both Trump and Barr into the sentencing, such behavior is a grave threat to the fair administration of justice. In this nation, we are all equal before the law. A person should not be given special treatment in a criminal prosecution because they are a close political ally of the president. Governments that use the enormous power of law enforcement to punish their enemies and reward their allies are not constitutional republics. They are autocracies. Yeah, and I think that gets it exactly right. They are autocracies. And my concern, and I think the concern of thousands and thousands of Trump critics in this country, is that not that Trump per se is going to win an election in 2020, and a guy who happens to be kind of crude and vulgar and insulting and thoroughly dishonest is going to win another 4 years. It's that we're seeing the erosion of democracy itself. We're seeing the erosion of a republic that was originally established way back in 1776 and defined 12 years later when the Constitution was written in 1787. And that Constitution underscores in a number of different ways the importance of what political scientists and political theorists generally call limited government. Limited government meaning, in other words, that the government does not have the power to do anything that it wants. This is a principle that was originally outlined way back in England in 1688 in what they call the Glorious Revolution back then. And the Glorious Revolution established the idea that England is a constitutional republic and that even the king exists below the law. That is to say, the law applies to everyone, even the king, to every member of parliament. And we inherited that tradition in 1776, and it was reaffirmed and kind of formalized when the Constitution was written. And the way in which we formalize that is to say that we have a system of checks and balances. The president is not all-powerful. The president must obey the law in the way that every other citizen of this country obeys the law. Well, the president doesn't always obey the law, and I think we see instances of that with what happened in the Stone prosecution. I think the president has said, and he made this very clear, that Article 2 of the Constitution is that article which focuses on executive power rather than legislative power. That Article 2 of the Constitution gives him the right to do anything that he wants to do. That's exactly what he said. And, of course, what these DOJ employees are saying is, no, that is not the case. And I think if you read your Constitution and if you read it carefully, I think we are all going to agree that that is not the case.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower this morning. Dr. Ostrower, some of the conservatives are listing sentences that convicted child molesters and rapists and killers are getting and saying that the Stone sentencing is way too harsh for the offense. What would the argument for that be? What would the argument back be?
Well, the argument is that the DOJ should be independent of political influence. Okay, what I get if I smoke a marijuana cigarette, whether I get 30 days in jail or 3 years in jail, is irrelevant to the degree to which the president is interfering and his attorney general are interfering in the administration of justice. It's a much larger issue. And I think the idea that, Stone's sentence, by the way, Stone's sentence was, I don't think, in any sense, too harsh. I think that it was within DOJ guidelines. You've often heard on conservative radio that, no, it was exceeded the guidelines. That is not true. It was within DOJ guidelines, and it was, he lied to a federal grand jury. He lied to prosecutors. This is not a simple matter of lying about whether or not he smoked a marijuana cigarette 30 years ago. This is a man, in other words, who had direct access to the White House. This is a very serious affair, and I think that the DOJ prosecutors were exactly within their rights to suggest the kind of thing. Now, we can argue, maybe it should have been 5 years rather than 9 years, but I don't think that any fair-minded person would suggest that Roger Stone should not be in jail. And if you do argue that, then you're simply a partisan. Then, in other words, the whole issue of fairness, the whole issue, in other words, of individuals being above or not above the law, that becomes irrelevant.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, the upcoming Nevada primary Saturday. Dr. Ostrower, do you have any thoughts on the Nevada primary?
Well, yeah, I have thoughts about the Nevada primary. I don't live in Nevada. I don't see all the ads that they must be receiving, and I think that I have no idea at this point as to who exactly is going to, triumph in the primary, other than to say that conventional wisdom, what appears to be, in other words, most of the pundits seems to be saying that Bernie Sanders is likely to win. But, we see all kinds of surprises. I mean, Trump was not expected to win the election in 2016, and he won. And so who knows? Maybe it's going to be Michael Bloomberg. Maybe it's going to be Amy Klobuchar. We simply don't know. But what all of those candidates seem to be saying, I mean, if there's anything that kind of connects their argument together, because, one argues for Medicare for all, and another says, no, there should be options for private insurance or medical, or Medicare for all, and so forth. Sure, there are some important differences. Some of them are relatively young. Of course, some of them, like Bernie Sanders, I think Sanders is 78 years old right now. So there are some, significant differences between the candidates. But the one thing that I think, holds all of their arguments, together, that kind of binds everything, is their opposition to the president. The idea that, there has to be a candidate who is able to defeat Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump is out of control right now. I think that, we see this after the acquittal when he purged the National Security Council of people who had testified under oath and told the truth, and because they told the truth, they were fired from the National Security Council. They were fired as ambassadors to the European Union and so forth. This is, I think, from the perspective of all of those Democratic candidates, kind of outrageous. But, who is going to win, who's going to come in second, I'm going to leave that to you, Brian, not to myself.
Does it seem to you, Dr. Ostrower, as a lot of people are saying, that Sanders is disliked by the Democrat leadership, and the Democrat leadership would really prefer someone like Mayor Pete?
Well, I think that Sanders is not so much that he's disliked, although I think there is a degree of dislike. Sanders is an ideological guy. He is rather uncompromising. I would argue that his positions today are probably not much different in respect to things like education, in respect to things like funding social programs, not much different than they were 30 years ago. I think there's a kind of rigidity there. I guess you'd call it an ideological rigidity, and I think that puts some of the Democrats off. But by the same token, I think the real opposition on the part of, I guess you'd call them mainstream Democrats, is that he's not going to win the election. I think that we know, most of us know, that Trump was like nothing more than a Sanders candidacy. And then you're going to, they're going to bring out every clip, every video, everything from Sanders over the last 30 or 40 years. They're going to paint him not as a socialist, which he is, but rather as a communist, which he is not. They're going to try to discredit him, and I think they'll probably be able to do it. I think that, generally speaking, we do not have a country that is all that sympathetic to socialism, and I think that's going to become, increasingly clear during the election. And, Sanders can argue that, look, public education is socialist, that Medicare is socialist, Medicaid is socialist, that the Postal Service is socialist, that there are many, many, quote, socialist, end quote, elements of our economy that we find acceptable. He can argue that the British have been socialist, that the Scandinavian countries are socialist, and that they may be more free than we are. Nevertheless, the fact of the matter is, going all the way back, I think, to the Haymarket riot in 1886, this country has not been and never has been very sympathetic to socialism, and I think that Sanders is going to get creamed by Trump if he runs in the election, and I think that the president understands that. I think the Democratic National Committee understands that, and that is why the Democratic National Committee is so fearful of a Sanders candidacy.
Mike Bloomberg, the audio coming out, does that hurt him politically with his supporters?
Yeah, I think it probably will. I mean, look, it's kind of making him a little, kind of humanizing him. And, of course, Bloomberg, I was listening to Fox this morning, and Newt Gingrich was interviewed, and he made the point that I believe, I'm trying to remember which state it is. I think it may be Alabama. I'm not positive. But in any case, one of the super, what do you call it, the Super Tuesday states, that Bloomberg has, or maybe this is total amount, that Bloomberg has spent something like $210 million versus only $10 million by Sanders. Well, I think that Gingrich is wrong by about half. I may be wrong, but I think that Bloomberg is now spending very, very close to $400 million. And what Sanders is going to argue is that this is a man, okay, you're entitled to run for the presidency, but you're not entitled to buy the presidency. And, Bloomberg has unlimited funds. He makes Trump look like a piker when it comes to billionaire status. And he's, the airwaves are going to be saturated in many, many states, certainly in all of the, questionable states by the end of the year, in the event that Bloomberg really does get the nomination. So, there's plenty of concern. But I want to make one other point about Bloomberg, if I may, and that is that, the guy's been around. He was mayor of New York for 12 years. He won 3 elections in order to do that. Spent an awful lot of money to win them, but he won those elections. And as mayor of New York, he really did a pretty credible job. Obviously, stop and frisk became very controversial, and I'm sure there are other controversial things that, I really don't know about. But for the most part, New York ran more effectively than it had in previous years. The crime rate was way, way down in New York. Again, for reasons maybe that doesn't have to do with Bloomberg so much as the fact that crime rates in most American cities were dropping, and they've been dropping ever since about 1990. So while mayors want to take credit for that, I think that we have to look at larger sociological issues. Nevertheless, the fact is that he was a pretty darn good administrator, and we're going to hear a lot about that administration in the event that he does get the Democratic nomination.
Biden, is he all done?
I don't think so. I think that there's a tendency to count people out on the basis of some of the early elections, some of the early primaries. I want to remind listeners that John McCain's campaign by the end of February in 2008 was in shambles. I believe that his campaign coordinator had left. I think some other campaign officials had been relieved of their own responsibilities. It looked like he was essentially out of the race, and we all know that John McCain got the Republican nomination to run in 2008. So it's a little bit early, I think, from my perspective, to count Biden out. And the most important reason, is that after all is said and done, it still may be that Biden has a better chance of defeating President Trump as a Democratic candidate, a better chance than any other Democratic candidate. And if that's the case, then he just may wind up at the convention as the nominee.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll come back and do This Day in History with Dr. Gary Ostrower. Stay with us.
The Ryan Agencies, your local, independent insurance agencies. The Ryan Agency employs 15 of your friends and neighbors. They live, shop, and support our community. When you buy insurance from the Ryan Agency, you support local families. Contact the Ryan Agencies today, your local source for all things insurance.
Insurance protection you can rely on. The Ryan Agency.
And we have meteorologist Rob Carolyn on the line. Rob says this snow is going to change to rain. It's going to get slushy.
It is. It's going to get slushy and sloppy, Brian. We've already got some rain out to our west. Temperatures in western New York have popped up almost to 40 degrees right now in the Dunkirk area. Buffalo's at 38. But we still got some moderate snow to light snow across our part of the world. Just an hour ago, Rochester was reporting snow. They've started to mix with and change to rain. It's due to low pressure, which is moving from Michigan towards the St. Lawrence River Valley. That's going to bring warmer air up from the south, and we'll see a change over to rain. So be careful. It's going to be kind of slippery out there, especially once that rain starts to mix in. It'll make it greasy. We will see snow changing to rain. It'll be breezy. We're 45 to 50. Tonight, looks like any showers could end as snow showers. Those will drop down to about 25. Partly to mostly cloudy and breezy with a chance of some flurries during the day tomorrow. Highs, they'll make their way only up to about 30. Even colder weather arrives tomorrow night, Brian. We're mostly cloudy with 10 to 15. And it's partly to mostly cloudy Thursday, 20 to 25. Temperatures will start to moderate by Friday. Sunrise earlier this morning was at 7:02, and the sun will set tonight at 5:46, Brian.
Thank you, Rob. Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower. This Day in History, Dr. Ostrower, February 18th, 1943. the leaders of what's called apparently the White Rose Resistance against the Nazis, Hans and his sister Sophie, were arrested by the Gestapo. This was apparently a bunch of medical students speaking out against the Nazis in Germany in 1943. What do we know about that, Gary?
Well, we don't know a huge amount about it, but what we certainly know is that the White Rose was one of the very, very few internal resistance movements in the country during the Nazi period. Remember, Germany was a totalitarian country. And when I say totalitarian, I mean that the German government, the Nazi government, had control of every single institution in Germany, over the church, over the police, over the educational system, and so forth. And every single element of the country. And so there was remarkably little internal resistance. There may have been a lot of internal unhappiness, but certainly very, very little of it ever kind of surfaced. The White Rose resistance was one of the few. There were a few others. I think that some of our listeners are probably know the story of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Lutheran minister who was very, very anti-Nazi and eventually paid for that with his life when he was executed by the Nazis, as were, of course, the members of the White Rose. But I think that it's unusual for people to, if you will, publicly oppose their own government. I think that in a democracy we have a lot more of that, but in a totalitarian country we have a lot less of it. In this country, what does President Trump want to do but to, if you will, close down or delegitimize the newspapers that are critical of him? Well, the Germans did that very, very effectively, and they did it from 1933 and 1934 right through 1945. So the ability of the people in the resistance to communicate with each other and so forth was really very limited. And I think we have to give the White Rose recognition, and I think we certainly want to remember their, I think, heroic resistance to Hitler, even though it turned out to be futile.
With that, we have to leave it. Dr. Ostrower, as always, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Welcome to the Democrat president.